Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I just appreciate you being with me so very, very much. And as promised yesterday, today I want to summarize what we have seen in regard to the Great Tribulation. We spent several videos now demonstrating the first century provenance and restriction on the Great Tribulation. The implications of what I've shared with you are literally profound. And I would suggest to you that what we have seen in our study of the Great Tribulation, is absolutely devastating to all futurist eschatologies. It is devastating to the dispensational view because it proves that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. Now, keep in mind, there are many amillennialists who also believe. Kim Riddlebarger, for instance. Kim Riddlebarger believes that the Great Tribulation is yet future. So, the fact that we have been able to demonstrate so clearly, and don't forget my book, Blast from the Past, The Truth About Armageddon, I'll have something special for you here in a moment so that, you want to take advantage of, I'm real sure. Nonetheless, in this book, I demonstrate without any doubt whatsoever that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. So, like I said, understanding the Great Tribulation is devastating to any futurist view in reality, because those eschatologies which put the Great Tribulation in the future immediately prior to the coming of the Lord are falsified. If the Great Tribulation was in the first century, then millennialism is falsified, and the amillennialism of men such as Kim Riddlebarger is falsified, because guess what? There is an inextricable bond and link between the Great Tribulation and the coming of the Lord, the judgment and the resurrection. Therefore, if the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century, that does mean the coming of the Lord, the judgment and the resurrection was in the first century. Now, the postmillennialists try to escape that dilemma by telling us, men such as Kenneth Gentry, Keith Matheson, James Jordan, etc., and of course he was a Reformed amillennialist, but nonetheless, they all tell us, yes, the Great Tribulation was in the first century, without any doubt whatsoever. What these good men fail to see, or in some cases perhaps refuse to see, is the fact that in Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, the Great Tribulation is absolutely inseparably bound with the resurrection, as we spent a good bit of time developing. So, when our postmillennial friends say, yes, the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century, they are thereby demanding, logically and scripturally, that the resurrection was in the first century. Simply stated, your view of the time of the occurrence of the Great Tribulation determines where or when all eschatology was or is fulfilled. If the Great Tribulation is yet future, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection is still future. If the Great Tribulation is past, then the resurrection, the coming of the Lord, and the judgment is past as well. So, in sum, what we have shared with you in this series on the Great Tribulation proves there is no futurist eschatology. The Great Tribulation was in the first century, therefore all futurist eschatologies are wrong. Point number two. This segues perfectly into point number two. All attempts to divide Matthew chapter 24 and 25 into two different subjects. Number one, the coming of the Lord in AD 70, and number two, the coming of the Lord at the so-called end of time. It's refuted because, remember, If the Great Tribulation, if the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation were first century events, that means the resurrection was a first century event. But if the resurrection was a first century event, then guess what? That means the resurrection was a first century event, and there is no division in Matthew 24 and 25. Point number 3, our study of the Great Tribulation. And oh, by the way, all of that proves the disciples were not wrong when they asked, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The disciples understood from prophecy that at the end of the age, the Great Tribulation would take place, and that Jesus had just predicted that destruction. They were not wrong. They were not confused at all. So, point number 3, we have demonstrated that the Great Tribulation would come as a direct result of Israel's violation of Torah, the law of Moses. Because the Hebrew and the Greek is literally the abomination that causes desolation. Historically, biblically, it was Israel's violation of Torah, committing abomination. Jeremiah 6, were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Jeremiah 32, God was bringing tribulation on Israel for her abominable acts. On and on and on we could go. So when Jesus said they were going to see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that abomination would lead to the tribulation. But the abomination of desolation would be as a direct result of Israel's violation of Torah. Now that proves one thing. 2 things. It proves that the abomination and the tribulation are directly related to Israel and Israel's covenant history. Number 2, by the way, it proves that the tribulation would be on Israel. It's not a worldwide tribulation. It's not tribulation coming on America for violating or for abandoning Israel ostensibly. It's not on Russia or China or South America. Remember, the abomination of desolation would be Israel's sin that would bring the tribulation on her. Since the tribulation would be God's judgment on Israel for violating Torah, that means the law of Moses did not pass away at the cross. Look, folks, I'm sorry. The only way you can prove that is to prove that the abomination is totally unrelated to Israel's sin. You would have to therefore demonstrate that all of this Old Testament background imagery and language in which Israel's abominations led to tribulation on her has no connection whatsoever. And yet, in Matthew chapter 24, and chapter 23, I should add, in chapter 23, Jesus listed the sins of Israel that was going to lead to her, what? Desolation, Matthew 23:37. Sin, i.e. abominations, desolation. And in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus continued that it was Israel's persecution of his followers that was going to lead to her desolation. Everywhere we turn, every aspect of the abomination and the tribulation focuses on Israel's sin and the judgment of Israel. And thus, once again, since the tribulation would be God's covenant judgment on Israel for violating Torah, then Torah did not pass away at the cross. I'm sorry, you cannot apply the covenant sanctions, the covenant penalties of a law after a law has been abrogated, annulled, and stricken from the books. So if the law of Moses was annulled, stricken from the books at the cross, then the covenant sanctions and the covenant penalties found in the law of Moses could not be applied in AD 70. So, Our study of the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation points us inexorably to the first century and to the judgment on Old Covenant Israel. And you see, here's kind of the exciting thing about this. In the Jewish narrative, the Jews well understood that in the last days, in the last generation, in Israel's last days, Deuteronomy 32, you would have the appearance of Elijah. You would have the great apostasy. You would have the arrival of the Great Tribulation. And that Great Tribulation would lead directly to the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection, the kingdom. That's the biblical narrative. That's Jesus' narrative. And it proves without a shadow of a doubt, the Olivet Discourse is not about two different subjects, or two different times, or two different peoples. It's about God's covenant judgment of Israel in the first century. Here's the great news. The Jews understood, the Bible taught, and Jesus taught, that with the taking away of Old Covenant Israel, the New Covenant world of Jesus, the everlasting kingdom of Messiah, in which dwells life and righteousness for anyone and for everyone of any nation and all nations, is now fully available. The old had to pass before the new would be fully established and set in place. And that's precisely what happened with the Great Tribulation, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, and the kingdom.